Hey guys, my name is Chris and I'm a senior software engineer in New York City, and today I'm going to show you how to implement the useFetch hook. This is a React hook and it's a very common technical interview question. Basically, if we have a React component, we want to be able to call this hook, pass it a URL, and fetch some data or an error. Throughout this video, if I lose you anywhere, leave me a comment down below with your clarifying question and I'll try to get to it as fast as I can. useFetch is a common custom React hook, which is basically a wrapper around the native fetch method and provides built-in loading, state handling, and error handling. So we can extract the bulk of the repetitive work from our React component out to our hook, and this will keep our component code dry and make the hook code extensible and reusable. So in this video, not only are we going to implement the useFetch hook itself, but also the React component which will consume it. Okay, so this is what we're going to be building. It's a NextJS app and a very simple sort of feature we're building out here, but it will help illustrate what we want to do. What we have is an array of 8 indices, and we're going to use those indices to fetch by number a list of 8 different posts, and each post has a title and some subtext below it. And what's going to happen is when we click this next post button, we should go from this one being 1 to 2. So it'll fetch number 2, and then it'll fetch number 3, and so on and so forth until we get to the end, to number 8, and we'll see a message saying reached end of list. So we're going to start by creating a new project. I'm going to do all of this work in a NextJS repo. So if you want, you can follow along and you'll have the same TypeScript linting rules in your own project moving forward. This way you can go in and play around and work through the same type errors that we will encounter in this video. So I'm going to type in npx create next app. Let me blow up this font size a little bit. At latest, this will give us the latest version of NextJS, and it's going to give us some options to pick through. What's the project named? Let's just call it useFetch example. Do you want to use TypeScript with this project? Yes, I do. Do you want to use ESLint? Yes, I do. Make sure you're following along with the same settings that I am so you see the same errors. Would you like to use the source directory structure? Yes, I do. That's fairly typical. Would you like to use experimental app directory? No, I don't think so. No experimentation here. What import alias would you like configured? I'll just go with the default, which is the @ symbol. And depending on your network speed, this could take anywhere from a few seconds to about a minute. Okay, so we've created this repository and I'm going to find it in my current directory. I had called it useFetch example, so I'm going to cd into that. useFetch. Okay, I'm here now. Let's take a look in Visual Studio Code. Okay, I have my project directory here. This is just sort of the empty NextJS project structure you'll get right off the bat. So we're going to work with that. Let's take a look at what we've got. We have this source directory and we have some things called pages. So our starting point is going to be this index file. I am gonna probably just get rid of most of what's in here by default. Maybe I'll just leave some of this top level stuff so we can kind of find where we are at in the page. Okay, let's create a new terminal within VS Code. I'm going to start this app up and take a look at what we actually have in the browser. Okay, started on localhost 3000. Let's take a look. Okay, so this is our basic NextJS app. Let's get rid of a bunch more of this sort of boilerplate stuff. I don't need any of that really. Okay, we'll keep that. Why not? So the first thing I'm going to want to do is create the component which will actually consume my useFetch hook. So what I'm going to do is within the source folder, I'm going to create a new folder called components. And in that is going to be where my component lives. I don't want to create my component in pages because if you're familiar with NextJS, the way that NextJS treats pages is like individual routes. I don't necessarily need this to be a route. It's just an individual component which is actually going to live within a page. Okay, so I'm going to create it in here. I'm going to call this component useFetch component tsx, that is my TypeScript React JSX format file. I'm going to set up some sort of boilerplate React code here. We're going to call it useFetch component. Type is a functional component, which is an import from React. And eventually, what this component is going to return is going to be the result of fetching some data from our useFetch hook. Or if we get back an error, we're going to want to display that error. So I don't necessarily know exactly how I'm going to format that response just yet. But for now, we can kind of just create some like boilerplate type stuff. And in here, this is where our data title is probably going to want to go. And maybe we'll have some subtext. This will be like the body text of our data fetch. And then we'll probably have some conditional stuff above that's like, you know, if we have an error, we're going to want to do something with the error, maybe like display a message saying, you know, you have some error. So we'll say, in this case, maybe we'll want to just return some text with whatever that error message is. Now I'm just sort of using stand-in text to signify the actual JavaScript values, which I'm going to use later on. These will eventually become variables, which I'm going to pull in from my data fetch. But for now, this will just let me know, you know, as sort of a visual reference on the page, what I'm going to want. I know, based on what I described before, that I am going to want 8 different potential posts that we could fetch. So I'm going to set up just a holder for those IDs. And this is going to be from 1 to 8. And then I'm also going to want some piece of state that lets us know which ID we are currently looking at. Import that from React. And we'll start with index 0. Now what we're going to want to do is we are going to want to set up this sort of boilerplate format of what the useFetch hook should look like. Here's where we're going to put our URL. And I'll tell you in advance, what we're going to do is we're going to use this JSON placeholder example site, which has basically just some dummy data, that lorem ipsum data that we saw before. So we're going to fetch at post IDs at the current index. Okay. So we don't know what useFetch actually does yet. We haven't defined it yet, but we will. But we know that in theory, it should return potentially an error and potentially some data. Okay. And this is where we get this logic for if there is an error, do this, blah, blah, blah. If not, we're going to do something with the data. Okay. So this is going to be where we will insert the JavaScript value for that data. And that's going to have a title. And this is going to be the data. And this should be our body text. Now, the other thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to include that next button that we saw at the beginning of the video. We want a next button to increment the current ID that we're looking at. Let's create another div to hold this button. Now we're going to get React yelling at us saying that JSX has to have a single parent element. So I'm going to wrap this entire expression in a fragment, just like this. And now inside of this div below is where I'm going to put my button. So we can clean this up a little bit later on, but we know this is going to be a button which takes us to the next post. In other words, when we click it, we want it to increment the ID that we're currently looking at. So on the click, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have it increment this index in state right here, okay? So I'm going to say increment index. This is going to be a function which we're going to define. Let's define this function right here. This is going to be increment index. And when this function is fired, we are going to call setIndex. And we're going to take the current index, and we're going to write an expression saying if the current index has reached the end of post IDs, then we're not going to increment it anymore. However, if we are from 1 to 7, then we are going to increment it. Okay. Now there's one other thing that we're probably going to want to do. If there is no error present, but there's also no data present, that will signify to us that we're in some sort of loading state where maybe we don't have an error, but we don't have data yet. So we're going to have to handle that situation as well. So I'm just going to do something really simple and say like, we are currently loading. So that's going to be the only thing that'll be rendered in that scenario. Now we have our component more or less built out. We'll do some refinements later on, but from here, we can move on to actually writing out the functionality of our useFetch hook. And this is the part of the process where if you were in a technical interview, this is probably more or less the boilerplate that you would be given, and your interviewer would say, okay, from here, build out the useFetch hook. So this is our starting point. Okay, let's get started building out this useFetch hook. What I'm going to do first is in my source folder, I'm going to create a new folder which will hold hooks. And within hooks, I'm going to create my useFetch file. And this is going to be a function. I'm going to call it useFetch. And what useFetch is going to take in is a URL. And then with any fetch, with the native fetch in JavaScript, you can also pass it some additional options. And we'll see what that looks like in just a minute. So the URL is always going to be a string. The options is going to be something called a request init. And this is just something that is native in JavaScript. Options is also, we're going to make that an optional parameter. We don't necessarily need that. It's just sort of like extra. I don't think we'll actually even go over that in this example. So let's not even worry about that for now. Okay, so useFetch takes in a URL. Now there's this pattern in programming called a state machine. And at very, very high level, what a state machine is it's a way of tracking the current state of some piece of data in your application. And the classic example that's always given is a stoplight. So think of a stoplight, a traffic light. There's 3 states, red, yellow, and green. So depending on the state of your data of your application at any given time, it might be red, yellow, or green. Now in our case, we're talking about fetching data. So the states that our data might be in is sort of in like an initialized state where we are loading or currently fetching. Now there's also a success state. In other words, the fetch has gone through successfully. And there's also an error state if the fetch fails. So we want to make sure that we have a pattern that captures all of those potential states. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a useReducer pattern. And I'm going to create a reducer. You know what? Let's actually create this reducer first. I'm going to create a reducer. This is going to be a function called fetch reducer. I'm creating it outside of the useFetch function so that we're not recreating this fetch reducer function every time that useFetch is called again. With any reducer, if you're familiar with the concept of reducers, this is a way of managing our state. You've probably seen this if you've worked with Redux or MobX. So it's going to take in a state and it's going to take in an action. And it's going to contain a switch statement, which will switch on the action's type and it's going to have several cases. Those cases are going to be the states that I mentioned before. So there's going to be an initialized state, in other words, like a loading or fetching state. So I'm going to call this fetch init. There's also going to be a success state. So I'm going to call this fetch success. And we're going to have to capture also our error scenario. And with any switch statement, there's always going to be a default. With a reducer, what we do with the default is we usually just return the state as is. So first we want to think about what is state in this case. Well, our state is going to have to capture really three things. Do we have data? Do we have an error? And are we currently loading or fetching? Okay, so in order to capture that, I'm going to type state as something like this. I'm going to create a new type called state, and it's going to have three things inside: data, error, and is loading. Is loading is just going to be true or false, so that's going to be a Boolean. Data. Now this is interesting because depending on which function is consuming our useFetch hook, data could really be anything. It could also be optional, by the way. We don't necessarily have to have data. It could be undefined. However, data could be anything, right? So how do we type this in a way where we can capture the type of data where it could be anything, and also use that same anything type throughout the rest of this code? Now we're going to use something called a generic. If you're familiar with the concept of generics, this should be sort of piece of cake. If you're not, I would recommend going back and watching my video on generics. So we're going to call the type of the data T. Okay, so we're going to have to give this state type a T generic initializer token here. We're going to say error. Error is also going to be optional, and that's going to be an error type. Now, fetch reducer also doesn't necessarily know what this T is going to be. So this is going to be a T generic as well, which we're going to initialize for fetch reducer also. Okay. Now, what is action? Action is going to be one of these three things. So initialized, success, or error. So let's type action as well. And action is going to be a type which is going to be a discriminated union type. I have an article on my website about discriminated unions. Essentially what we're doing is we are saying that this may be one of several different things. So it can be either an object where we have a type that is fetch init, or it might be an object where we have type, let's just copy paste this, fetch success. And in the case that it has the type of fetch success, it's also going to have a payload, which is going to contain the data that we've successfully fetched. Now again, this data, as we saw in state, we don't necessarily know what it is. It kind of could be anything, but we need to propagate the value of whatever that data is throughout the application code, right? So the data type is also here going to be a T generic. So we're going to have to initialize that T generic here, which means we're going to have to pass T to our action here as well. Okay. Now there's one more union type that action could be. We need our error state, right? So type is going to be fetch error. And in this case, the payload is actually going to contain an error. So we use the error type here. So now we have our parameters of the fetch reducer typed, and let's define what is going to happen when these actions are fired. So in the init case, the reducer is going to return whatever state currently is, but we're going to flip is loading to true. When the success action is fired, we're going to return, again, whatever state currently is, but we're going to want to flip is loading to false. And we're also going to want to pass in the data, which is going to be captured on the action's payload. And then we just have to define the error. So in the case that we fire an error action, we're going to again return whatever state currently is, but then we're going to again flip is loading to false, and the error value here is going to actually capture what is contained in the payload, which is going to be that error. Okay, we've gotten this far. Let's clean up a few things. Let's improve a few things. We have this type error going on. UseFetch cannot be compiled under isolated modules, blah, blah, blah. What I want you to do, if you're watching this video, pause the video here, give this a read over, and see if you can figure out what is causing this. So what we're doing here is we just need to actually have an export statement in order for this module to be legitimate. So what we're going to do is we're going to say export default useFetch. That'll clear that. And now one enhancement we can do is on this fetch reducer function, we can create a return type. And if you've seen Matt Pocock's videos on YouTube, he has a great video, which I'll link, where he talks about return types. Usually we want to use return types when a function could return multiple different things, okay? So what is the return type going to be here? It is going to be state, again, of T, generic. Now we can use fetch reducer within our useFetch hook. So, thinking sort of top to bottom, what does useFetch do? Well, it's going to fetch some data or an error, and it's going to return a blob like this, like state, so that our useFetch component can consume it and use error or data, or theoretically is loading if we want to. Okay, so useFetch is going to return, we're going to use a return type here again. It's going to return state. Again, we need to pass state a generic. So we're going to use the same pattern as before. We're going to initialize useFetch function using one generic. Okay. So if you're not super familiar with TypeScript, pause the video here, see if you can figure out what this is saying. Okay, so now in order to actually set up this fetch reducer that we've created to work within the context of all the things that we want to do, is we need to use the useReducer hook. And the way that we do that is a pattern like this. So we're going to destructure state and dispatch, state being, again, this sort of blob of info where we have data, error, and is loading, and dispatch, which is an event that we can trigger. And we're going to destructure those from the result of calling useReducer, which we get from React. So you notice I just hit enter there when I got the tooltip. I'll do that again. I get these IntelliSense suggestions in VS Code. So I'm just clicking enter here. And when I click enter on this useReducer option at the top from React, it's going to automatically import at the top here. We're going to use useReducer. We're going to call it, and we're going to pass it two things. First, we need to pass it the reducer function, which is up here, right? Our fetch reducer function. So the first argument we're going to pass it is fetch reducer. And the second argument we're going to need to pass it is the initial state. And what the initial state is going to be for our application, again, state is this blob, so it needs to have these values, data, error, and is loading. So data is going to be initialized as undefined. We don't have any data yet. We haven't done anything yet. Error, also going to be undefined. And is loading is going to initialize to false. So these are the values we're going to start out with. So now that we have called our useReducer hook, we can use state and dispatch. And since we know that within state, we're going to have a data, an error, and an is loading, we can actually just destructure those from state here. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to say is loading, error, and data. So now we can use these three values as well as dispatch. So when we call our useFetch function, we want it to trigger a fetch. So I can use a useEffect hook on that. And this useEffect function will run when the useFetch function is called. So what do we want to happen when useEffect is called? Well, we want to fetch some data. And let's define what fetch data will do. So this is going to be a function. And remember we had talked about our three sort of traffic light states, right? So we have this loading state, we have a success state, and we have an error state. So when we're fetching data, the first thing we want to happen is for our program to be in this sort of loading initialized state. So what we're going to do is we're going to dispatch an action whose type is fetch init. So this is going to be the state of our application while we are fetching data. Now what we're going to do next is we are going to attempt to fetch if there is data. In other words, if there is a success, then we're going to pass the data to our state. And if there is an error, pass an error to our state, like that. So let's wrap this in a try-catch block. Remember, whenever we are working with promises, in other words, whenever we're working with fetches in this case, we want to always make sure we catch any errors. We want to make sure we're handling any errors. If there are unhandled errors, it's going to basically crash the UI if we don't do anything to handle those promise rejections. So we're going to first await fetching this URL, which means we're going to have to make this fetch data an async function. If you're not familiar with the syntax, go check out async await. And I'm going to capture the response of this in just something called response. There's a possibility that this response may come back with data, but not a like 200 OK status. So I'm going to say if the response OK is not, if it's, in other words, if it's falsy, then we're going to want to capture that error. And I'm going to throw an error here with that response, and it'll have on it some status text saying like, 503 server is down, something like that. Otherwise, we're going to await getting that response, transforming it, and we're going to capture that value in another variable called data. And if we do indeed have this data variable, that means that we have successfully fetched data. And we're going to fire a success action. So I'm going to dispatch an action whose type is fetch success, and its payload is going to capture that data which was fetched. So that's our try portion. Now we're going to catch any errors that might have occurred. And if there was an error, we're going to dispatch an action whose type is error and whose payload is that error. And it looks like we're getting a type error here, so we'll see type unknown is not assignable to type error. Okay, I think this is because, yeah, in a try-catch block, the error definition here is of type unknown, and we have defined our error again as an error type, capital E error. So we're going to have to cast this error as an error type in order to make TypeScript happy here. Now at the very end of this useFetch function, we are going to want to return whatever these three values are: is loading, error, and data. And looks like we're getting another type error here. Let's see what this is. Type unknown is not assignable to type T or undefined. Okay, so somewhere data is unknown. So where is data defined? It's defined here. Here, data is unknown. However, this is interesting because I know that in our state, we had defined data as a T value. Now, this data is coming from our useReducer. And the useReducer is taking in our fetch reducer, which I know I had returned a state of T. So I think what I have to do, I've just missed one small thing here. It's that this fetch reducer is creating a new generic T value that's not related to the generic T value which I was defining in useFetch, right? When we're talking about generics, we're just defining relationships. I want every single T in this entire file to have the same relationships. Every T here should be the same T. So we need to pass this T from the parent function useFetch into this child function, fetchReducer. Looks like we get another one. FetchReducer refers to a value, but is used as a type here. I believe this is just a compiler error, so let me reload TypeScript, and that should, yeah, in fact, that now goes away. Okay, something missing here from our useEffect hook. We don't want this to run continuously. We only want it to run once, so I'm going to pass it this dependency array, and it's probably going to say, oh, you missed a dependency. Yeah, okay, we're going to need to include fetch data in this dependency array, and that is going to, wow, that just blew up. It highlighted my entire fetch data function. What's it saying here? Fetch data function makes the dependencies of the useEffect change on every render. Okay, so because fetch data is a function, anytime this function is recreated, it's going to trigger this useEffect to run again and again and again. So we want to memoize, in a sense, this fetch data function. And we're going to do that using React's useCallback hook. So we're going to wrap this entire fetch data function in a useCallback. Let's see, does it give us, yep, I'm going to update that, import it from React. We're going to call useCallback. We're going to pass this entire function definition into useCallback. It's going to need a dependency array. And again, it's going to yell at us. It's going to say it's missing a dependency URL. Okay, let's include that there. Good. Now, looks like this is acting up again. Not sure why. Let's restart TypeScript again. All good. So if you're watching this and you're wondering, well, why didn't we just put the fetch data function into the useEffect hook? We totally can. However, in this case, I just defined it outside of it so that in the future we could extend it use it again and again, use it outside of the useEffect hook. If we wanted to do like advanced caching, refetching, cache invalidation, etc. Okay, I think we're looking good. Let's make sure this file is saved, and let's import our hook into our component. Okay, so import, and look at how it is automatically importing as an aliased absolute path import. Remember when we were initializing our NextJS project and I said, how do you want to do aliased imports? I want to do the @ symbol. That's what it's going to do. Okay, so we have imported our hook, and okay, seeing a couple type errors here. Property title does not exist on type object. So data here is not typed. And it's coming in as an unknown. And that is because we want to actually explicitly type what we expect to get back from this useFetch hook. So we want it to be, well, I'll give you this one, right? If we were to go to this URL and see, what does a post actually look like from this dummy data, let's go to 0. Okay, 0 has nothing. Let's go to 1. It has a user ID, it has an ID, it has a title, and it has a body. So let's just create a thing that has those types. Let's call this thing a post. So it has these 4 things. So it has a user ID. I'm going to do a little trick here. I'm highlighting a whole bunch of these apostrophes using Command D. Just going to remove them. User ID is a number. ID is a number. Title is a string. And body is also a string. So we expect useFetch to give us back a post. And now our data is typed, and we have removed those type errors down here. All right, let's actually give this a spin in the browser and see how we're looking. Looks like we had some Webpack issues, so I'm going to restart my server. Caching failed, unable to resolve snapshot dependencies. Let's see what it's not liking here. Duh. I wasn't actually rendering useFetch component anywhere. Okay, so it's exported. Let's bring it into our main page. And we're going to render useFetch component here. Again, I did that automatic import thing that I showed before. Render it. And next post, next post, next post. Let's go all the way to the end. Okay, I'm at the end and I'm still given the option to click through to the next post. I want to make sure that if I've reached the end of this data, it doesn't still show the next post button. It actually just shows some text saying like, you've reached the end of your data set. So instead of just simply rendering the button here, what I'm going to do is say, if the current index, which I've defined here in state, if the current index is the same as, like if we've reached the end of our post list, then I want to render just some text saying you've reached, reached end of list. Otherwise, I want to render this next post button. So now when we've reached the end of the list, we'll just see this text here. Now we could do a whole lot of cleanup with CSS, make this pretty. I'm not really going to worry about that in this tutorial. Yeah, this is basically it, guys, for the kind of basic functionality. Now, there are some improvements we could do. We could add caching. If we wanted to cache the responses, we could do something like probably in global memory or in module memory. We could do something where we create a cache, and this would be like an object, and what this would contain would be, I'm thinking like for every fetch to a URL, which is a string, it would have an accompanying value, which is some data, which really could be anything. And then with this cache defined, every time that we go to actually call this fetch data function, we could basically like check the cache, and if a cache exists for this URL, return it. So this would be something like if cache at URL, then we're going to dispatch a success action, and its payload is going to be that cached value. And then we're going to want to make sure we return here. And in order to actually place our fetched data within the cache, we need to make sure that when we get this data back here, we're saying something like cache at URL equals our data. Something like that. Again, we're getting this weird type thing. I don't know why. If somebody knows, leave me a comment. I don't know why my compiler keeps acting up about that one. Of course, this will basically always cache responses, which may or may not be a good thing. If you are fetching to the same URL and you are caching the response to that URL like this, then you are assuming that whatever data exists at that URL will always be the same. So just a caveat there. Another improvement, enhancement, call it what you want. In the use hooks repo on GitHub, there is this optional cancel request functionality. I'm not really going to go too into it here, but basically if the component is unmounted before the data is recovered, the fetch won't be called. So you're saving your program a little bit of processing power. Another note, actually, with caching, this doesn't necessarily need to be kept in memory of the application. It could be cached in something like local storage in your browser or in some separate service. It could be cached in AWS, for example. But then you're getting into this whole idea of like, do we want to reach out to some third-party service to check a cache? You could do it in something like Redis. Now we're kind of going on a tangent. Okay, yeah, this is my basic implementation of useFetch. Again, if you have any questions, clarifying questions, comments, suggestions for how I can improve this, please leave a comment. I would be very eager to see how people have solved this same interview problem differently. Thank you so much for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please leave me a comment and let me know what you would like to see next. And if you like, you can share it with a friend. Feel free. Thank you very much. See you in the next one.